With us today is David Bell, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Schools. David had a glittering career in education before he became Chief Inspector. He was a teacher in a primary school, he was a 29-year-old primary head teacher, he was the youngest Director of Education in the country when he was in Newcastle, and he became a Chief Executive as well. He's been described as a man it's very difficult to dislike. So what's a nice chap like you, David, taking on Ofsted for?
Well, I've had a very wide-ranging career, as you suggested, and this seemed a logical next step. I've done a number of local authority jobs, school-based jobs, and I was very intrigued by the possibility of doing a national job. And
your friends didn't take you on one side and say, steady on,
well,
or didn't know what you're biting off?
My wife did say to me that she was now married to the most unpopular man in England, but I think we've managed to get over that since. Yeah. I always had a tremendous regard for Her Majesty's Inspectors of Schools. So when I was a teacher and a head teacher, I had a tremendous advice and support from HMI who'd come to visit where I was working. So that was a great tradition that I was wanted to be part of. At the same time, I recognised that the Ofsted style of school inspections have been very different. And I
thought, better or different worse?
Different. I think the old days of HMI inspecting schools, great, people can be very romantic about that, but they inspected very infrequently, and that kind of information that they generated in the main wasn't published. Ofsted brought about a radical change in school inspection. Schools been inspected more frequently, reports been published. And when I came into the job, I thought there was an opportunity to build on the tradition, but also to look and rethink, to some extent, school inspection.
Well, what about free speech? Because, I mean, you're a person who's got very good experience, and you've got views of your own, of course. Are you able to speak your mind, or are you in a kind of political quandary? Because if you're not careful, you could offend the government of the day, for example.
I'm never in a political quandary, because Ofsted is a non-ministerial government department. In shorthand, it's independent of the ministers of the day and the Prime Minister.
Is it still truly independent?
It is absolutely independent, insofar as I have the final say in everything published by Ofsted. Ministers and senior officials, as a matter of courtesy, will see draft reports and they may choose to comment on it. That's fine. I decide what's published.
But don't you have to have half an eye on how a minister might react, or even the Prime Minister, because he takes a personal interest?
I don't have an eye on that. At the same time, I think I have to work in a constructive manner with politicians. I want Ofsted to be independent, I want it to be authoritative, but I also want it to have influence. And it seems to me that I'm more likely to have influence as Chief Inspector if I deal in a professional and straightforward manner with the politicians of the day.
Nowadays, you've got head teachers who've had, say, 3 different inspections if they've been in 2 schools, and they're able to compare teams. And they often see quite significant differences between a good team that is rigorous and so on, and positive and helpful, and another team that may be, from their point of view, not because it's critical, but simply doesn't seem to do as good a job.
In the last 12 months, there have been 5,000 separate individuals who've inspected at least once, and I think that does present some issues of consistency. In the new system, we'll need fewer than that, and I think that will help. On the other hand, I wouldn't exaggerate the extent to which head teachers are dissatisfied with Ofsted. In the last term, for example, the head teachers survey that we conduct after inspection, that's head teachers commenting on their experience of inspection, 94% of them have said that they were satisfied with the way in which the inspection was carried out and felt that it was useful to them.
But you see, I think the problem there is that I have with that is that the word is satisfaction. I mean, the question that gets asked is, are you satisfied with the conduct of the inspection? So I think actually, really, heads are much more critical. And if you ask them a different question, like, for example, would you have spent that amount of money on that particular group of people giving you that particular form of feedback? Relatively few would. It certainly would be way, way short of 90%.
It's difficult to tell, isn't it? Because we can go on the data that we've got. Head teachers can express their views frankly and openly, and I can assure you they do when they respond to us. I've been on the receiving end of Ofsted inspections, and I suppose it's fair to say that inspectors are never going to be your favourite people.
Did you spit blood when they'd gone?
No, I didn't. I tried to keep calm before they came, and I tried to keep calm when they were there. I don't think you'll ever get 100% approval ratings for inspectors. That's the nature of the business. I think I would look at other kinds of evidence that we have of how schools have improved over time, how inspectors working, for example, in failing schools have helped to bring about improvement. There have been a whole range of changes and reforms to the English education system, of which inspection has been one. But I think taken together, the various changes have brought about improvement. And I certainly very vigorously defend the work that Ofsted has done over the past decade.
Yeah. I'm sure you do, and I've got a more negative view, because you see, I see it as something which has a much bigger fear factor than I think is healthy. You know, I mean, there's fear in the school, and that seems to me to be a wrong climate for improvement. Also, the very mechanical way that inspections have been, I mean, I'm not talking about the future now, but in the past, the legacy, if you like, is this very mechanical form of inspection with its formulaic pronouncements about above average, below average, and so on. I mean, no one talks that kind of language. You don't say, I enjoyed my breakfast, the sausage was above average, but the beans were below the national average, and I've taken my car to the garage and they put it in special measures. I mean, no one talks like that.
It's fair to say, of course, that inspection, like any other discipline, generates its own jargon. It's an important factor, however, to me that we ensure that inspection reports, as best they can, state what they find clearly and openly. Now, we know that parents make good use of Ofsted reports. One of the things that we're trying to develop for our new system is even sharper and clearer judgments that will be helpful and understandable. But again, I wouldn't overstate how difficult it's been in the past. Don't forget, in 1992-3, when these first new style inspections were set up, they were a major shock to the system.
I mean, I agree with you. I think it was a shock to the system. And two things I think are positive. One is that there's now a regular cycle, which there wasn't in the past. And the other is that even if you don't like a particular framework, at least you can see what inspectors are supposed to be looking at, which again used to be a magical mystery tour. But I still think that it's, I mean, Ofsted has become a kind of generic now. I mean, if you want to frighten people, you say Ofsted.
I think it's fair to say that we're a well-known brand name. A recent debate in the House of Commons, one MP said to the Chancellor, you need an Ofsted-style inspection of the nation's finances. Now
most of them say the opposite, though. We don't want an Ofsted-style inspection.
I'm not sure what the Chancellor's reaction was to that. I think that demonstrates that Ofsted has become a kind of currency to describe inspection and oversight. And it's more positive. I think many schools see an Ofsted inspection as an opportunity to review the progress that they've made, to identify some recommendations to move on, and also to give a public statement of how well they're doing. Sometimes, of course, it's a public statement of not something quite so positive. It's a statement of how badly they're doing. That's a small minority of cases, but I do think that regular reporting of school performance is important.
But what about relationships with the teaching profession? The underlying climate is still one that Ofsted is a compliance enforcement body. I mean, I find this in teacher training. You know, there's an emphasis on compliance. Now, I dislike that, and I think many teachers dislike the idea that part of Ofsted's role is to say, are you towing the line? I can understand why it's there, but that's, I think, the kind of state police side of Ofsted that's hard to shake off.
I think when Ofsted was set up in 1992, it was probably important to have some minimum levels to comply against, because or to comply with, because we did find a certain unevenness. Now, I don't think you can continue to run an inspection system just merely on compliance. People sometimes find it difficult to understand when I say we don't have any preferred model of teaching or learning or school organisation or leadership. We want to be able to judge schools by the outcomes they achieve. And I think that's very important. I see it myself visiting lots of different schools, that there is no one road to salvation.
But here's the interesting thing, you see, because I'm often asked to talk about creative teaching. And I can guarantee when I've finished talking, that whether it's head teachers or whatever, people will say, that's all very interesting, love to do those things, but what about Ofsted? I mean, they see Ofsted as part of a compliance culture. And I mean, also, Ofsted inspectors were specifically told not to be critical of government policy. And that's part of the compliance culture where teachers are now scared to step outside QCA schemes of work, the numeracy and literacy hour framework and so on, particularly if Ofsted are around.
Certainly, in my time as Chief Inspector, nobody said to me, you must ensure that your inspectors check that teachers are complying with government policy. I've had a lively debate with senior civil servants about this, that Ofsted inspectors are not there to check whether the literacy hour has been taught in a particular way. Yes, they do accept it. They recognise that our job is to inspect the outcomes achieved by the pupils. Now, I happen to believe, in relation to the literacy strategy and the numeracy strategy, that there have been quite a lot of benefits that have gone alongside those strategies in terms of how teachers have taught. But it's not a case of saying, let's go into a lesson, let's see if they comply. I've been in literacy lessons which are frankly pretty dull, although they comply in a sense with the guidance. I've been in outstandingly good literacy lessons which are a bit different. It's all about the way the teacher teaches.
But why can't Ofsted say this? I mean, why can't Ofsted be critical of government policy and say, you know, government, I mean, you'd be critical of other aspects, if you know, because you've produced some very trenchant reports about different aspects of education, but on the whole they don't say that the government is making teachers teach literacy hours that are in 4 parts and numeracy hours in 3 parts, and this is leading to too much repetitive teaching. It takes people like Michael Merporgo, the Children's Laureate, saying this is no way to teach literature, and I'm a writer, he's saying.
Yes, I mean, I sometimes am a bit sceptical about that approach from some of the great children's authors, much though that I respect them and read their works. We need children to read. Too many children were getting to the end of their primary education not reading to an appropriate standard. I believe the National Literacy Strategy has helped to bring about improvement, but, and it's an important but, it's not a case of just teaching in a formulaic way. And I've said that, I've actually argued very strongly in published reports that if it's simply a case of banging away in exactly the same old format to the way we've always taught things under the literacy strategy or any other strategy, we're not necessarily going to get the results that we want.
Does anybody listen to you, though?
Absolutely. Teachers need to feel confident.
I mean in government, does anybody listen? Do ministers listen and senior civil servants?
I think the way in which we've seen government policy towards primary education evolve over the past 2 or 3 years has largely come about because Ofsted has published reports that have, I think, influenced their thinking. For example, we published a report called The Curriculum in Successful Primary Schools, which made the point that actually the best performing primary schools in all sorts of social circumstances were those that had a broad and balanced curriculum. They did not have an unduly narrow focus on literacy and numeracy. And I do believe actually that the government's moves to have a wider primary strategy have come about because of that kind of guidance.
I mean, there might be some negative points. You've made the point yourself about how too many children are being switched off books, for example. You know, okay, fine, but it's not really aimed at the government and their strategies. I mean, can you really produce that kind of hard-hitting report that actually makes government stop in their tracks and change?
We had a very damning report on teacher education and further education, which almost on the same day brought about a substantial response from government to generate reform. So we do that. I think the climate's quite different as well to the 1980s, 70s and 80s when chief inspectors were not under the same kind of public scrutiny. Maybe the media.
So it does get to you in the end?
No, I think the media scrutiny is different. Education is a much more politicised subject, and I think that's a good thing, actually, in some ways, that politicians believe that they should be talking about education, they should be interested in education. So I think it's only right that newspapers, the media more generally, cover education. I certainly know from my experience as Chief Inspector, anything I say generates a lot of interest in the media, and the media want to hear what the Chief Inspector has to say.
Now, what about inspectors themselves? I mean, there's been a bit of discussion about how they're selected and whether you always get the right people, whether or not you get a few people who perhaps shouldn't have been there, they just left teaching, not always in the wake of great success, but they end up inspecting. And also, of course, the other problem that schools feel which is that there's no appeal against judgments. So you might appeal against procedures, but judgments, you know, you just have to accept what they say. So if someone comes into your classroom and says, that's a rhinoceros and it's a guinea pig, you can't appeal. It's their judgment.
Well, you could appeal in that case if we think about it, because there the evidence would be quite manifestly in favour of the teacher. And I think that's the point.
The science teaching is lousy and the school's saying, well, actually, it's not too bad.
Well, you can't make a judgment in isolation from the evidence. If you make a judgment about a school, in the end, inspection is about making professional judgments, but it's not about just pronouncing ex cathedra. You have to have evidence to support your judgments. Clearly there's an issue of interpretation about evidence, but that's the business of inspection.
But the judgments can be frail. I mean, if inspectors themselves are not necessarily top-notch practitioners, or if you've got a secondary inspector who's a specialist in music in a secondary school who finds that they're looking at music in a primary school, for example, and they don't really understand, I mean, there's not an awful lot you can do about it. You can't say, we reject the inspector. Who actually inspects the inspectors in the end?
one of my responsibilities at the moment, and it will continue to be the case even if we change the inspection arrangements, is to ensure we get the right people inspecting schools. Now, I wouldn't pretend other than there have been a few people that haven't reached the appropriate standard. I have deregistered inspectors in my time as Chief Inspector, and it's right that I have that freedom to do so. Certainly the new system of school inspection that's being proposed in Parliament at the moment will give me an even greater influence over the people that inspect. At the moment I'm slightly constrained by the legislation as it stands, but again I wouldn't exaggerate the point. Where inspectors have seriously underperformed, we have dealt very efficiently and strongly with them. But the majority of inspectors are conscientious people. They want to do a good job. They want to make sure that when they come to judgments about the quality of education in a school, they are secure and supported by the evidence.
Do you think that improvement and inspection are too detached from each other? I mean, after all, inspectors go in, they say this needs doing and that needs doing, and then they disappear. You never see them again.
In the end, inspectors don't bring about improvement in schools. That's the job of head teachers, governors, and those that are responsible for education in the school. And I think if you start to confuse inspection findings with advice, people are then left uncertain actually about are they doing this just to meet what the inspectors require. Inspectors leave recommendations and key issues for action. It is then appropriately the decision of the school about how they go about implementing them.
Now this is where I disagree as well, because back in HMI times, and I'm no great fan of the old days on this because I think there are a lot of fault, but one thing that HMI were able to do, I mean, for example, they put on very good courses. I went on HMI courses, you may have done.
Well, in the last year alone we've run over 20 such courses in the different subjects of the curriculum where we do exactly as you've described, Ted. We bring together teachers and others, and we allow our inspectors, our HMI, to talk about what they found in the subject, but then we use it as an opportunity to showcase the very best of practice.
But I don't think they're as intensive and as sustained as those courses used to be. I mean, they ran over a whole year. They were known sometimes as 40-session courses. I mean, I went on a music course run by HMI. I thought it was one of the most fantastic courses I've ever been on. It really set me alight.
The difference then, between now and then, is that perhaps HMI were one of the few bodies nationally providing such training. Now, of course, we've got a plethora of bodies, both private and public, offering national training and national courses. But we are still keen to ensure that inspection findings and the best of practice is shared and shared widely.
Now, what about the changes that are coming up? For example, the role of the lay inspector is being changed. Now, I must say I welcome this. I thought it was wrong to put lay inspectors in the front line of making critical judgments about the quality of teaching, for example, when they may not know very much about it. Relationships with parents and all sorts of other things, the climate in the school, fine, but not that.
Ironically, a lot of lay inspectors thought they were being asked to do too little. They thought that they were too confined into certain areas, and of course we were keen to encourage them to ensure that they dipped into all aspects of a school's life and work, contributing to the wider evidence base available.
But they're going now. Well, not they're going, but I mean...
They are indeed. We're not... the proposal before Parliament is that there should no longer be a requirement to have a lay inspector. I think that the lay inspector as a requirement in every school inspection team has served a useful purpose, but wouldn't in the future. Another important reason, of course, we're talking about much shorter inspections in the future, much smaller teams. And therefore it really would be a demand too far to have every school inspection team with a lay inspector.
Now, one thing, a change that is relatively recent, that I thought was a bit naughty was Ofsted suddenly announcing, on a number of occasions, that satisfactory is no longer satisfactory. Now, that seems arrogant to someone outside Ofsted. I mean, you can't tinker around with the English language. If satisfactory, how about saying unsatisfactory?
Indeed. I mean, I raised this in my annual report 2 years ago. In fact, I didn't say satisfactory wasn't good enough. I actually asked the question, is satisfactory good enough? I was led to ask it by many teachers, particularly teaching in the most difficult circumstances, who would say to me, in this school, satisfactory isn't good enough. We cannot bring about the kind of change and improvement that we require by just being satisfactory. So I think it is entirely legitimate to say, Ted, that something that is satisfactory is competent, but it may not be enough to bring about the improvement. Surely we should be aspiring to good very good and excellent teaching. And that was the reason for stimulating that debate, and I think it's an important debate to have.
What about some of the changes that are likely to come about in the future? Are they just going to be cosmetic? I mean, simple example, short notice inspections. Now, I think if you're not careful, this becomes treating the symptoms rather than the causes. One of the causes of dismay amongst teachers is that they're not happy with the process. They feel the process is an unpleasant one and could be better. Changing the notice seems to me to be tinkering about with symptoms, because if you've got a good process that people feel confident about, then frankly whether they know 6 months in advance or 6 days in advance is neither here nor there. But if it's not a good process, then equally they'll be neurotic all the time if they don't know, rather than just being neurotic for a few months.
I'd far rather see, and I think teachers would far rather be seen in the natural setting of the day-to-day life of the school. That's one important reason for bringing about the change of notice. But there are other changes. We're not in the future going to be inspecting every subject of the curriculum. We're not going to try to do the all-encompassing inspection. Secondary school at the moment might have 12 to 15 inspectors over 4.5 days. We're not going to try to do that in the future. Now, I've been very honest about...
But it'll be more frequent, so you might have fewer days, but it'll be happening more often.
It will happen.
In the end, maybe it's going to be just as intense.
I don't think it will be. We've done now 100 pilots of this new model approach to inspection. I think demonstrating actually our seriousness to almost test the model to destruction. The feedback we've had has been incredibly positive, even where the judgments have been quite tough. And one of the most striking things said to me recently by a head teacher who'd been on the receiving end of such an inspection was the school, in a sense, took it much more in the natural flow of events. The shorter notice meant the school was seen as it was, and the school had the inspection and then moved on rapidly. There are some trade-offs. I mean, we're not going to get the kind of evidence-based subject by subject in every school. We're
Does
not
that
necessarily
matter
going.
if
Well, precisely.
there's a kind of general impact that's more effective?
That's exactly my point. That's exactly my point. That it seems to me that we should be trying, as far as we can, to concentrate on what I've called the central nervous system of the school. Because if you can get at that, and I think we can demonstrate that we can get at that, do we then need to go and check for a third or fourth time in an inspection system that the history, the geography, the science, the music are being taught efficiently? So I think we can use this new system as an important lever. The other thing to say about that is greater use of schools' own self-evaluation and evidence.
But the problem with self-evaluation is that, again, in itself, it may appear harmless, but it depends how it's used.
Indeed.
For example, some heads have expressed dismay that they were absolutely brutally honest and they laid open all their problems and so on, then found these were bounced back on them, and suddenly they appear to have weaknesses, and of course the inspector's saying, well, you identified them, and they're then saying to their friends, don't you be honest, you know, say you've got a problem with the car parking or something, but don't come up with any serious stuff.
Yes.
And now people swap their S4 forms where they fill in their self-evaluation, and they say, well, ours was pretty well received, and people start modifying someone else's, and the exercise becomes another game with its own rules that some people learn to play fairly quickly.
And it's a waste of time if it's just a game. It's a waste of time if it's just a process. The very best self-evaluation is something that makes a difference on a day-to-day basis, because teachers, head teachers and others are reviewing what they're doing, as the best teachers do, lesson by lesson, minute by minute. Now, you talked about brutal honesty. I was brutally honest as well when we gave greater emphasis to school self-evaluation from September 2003 onwards, when I found that some inspectors were just focusing on the weaknesses and saying, well, that tells us all we need to know. And I made it very clear, and I made it public, that wasn't effective and efficient use of school self-evaluation.
But you see, the problem was, I mean, inspectors' training, the film that was put out, just one example, the video that was made, the emphasis here was on how do you grade this school, and people were saying, well, it's all right, it's not brilliant, but it's okay, and they were told, no, this is a coasting school, a cruising school, you know, you should be smoking this out. And so they formed the impression, wait a minute, we're being coached here to look for weaknesses. I mean, in a sense, Ofsted made that self-fulfilling.
I don't think we were coaching inspectors to look for weaknesses. I think we were saying to inspectors there may be underlying issues in a school that you need to get at, even though the headline data may suggest a school is doing well. That, I think, is a serious issue to investigate, but it's not proper inspection practice just to focus on the weaknesses.
And I have to say, I thought the self-evaluation of Ofsted that came out rather naughtily, I thought, on the 30th of July 2004, when all the teachers were disappearing, looked a bit complacent to me, because it was saying things are going pretty well, you know, we're a kind of world-class organisation. So who actually really inspects the inspectors at the end of the day?
I think on the issue of our own internal evaluation, it wasn't actually the way it was portrayed as sort of Ofsted had just given itself its own pat in the back. We used one of the most distinguished researchers in the education community to work with us from the Institute of Education to look at that.
But shouldn't it have been entirely external?
Well, I am accountable to Parliament. I laugh actually when people say to me, of course you're accountable to no one. I say to myself, you come and sit, as I do, twice, 3 times a year in front of members of Parliament, really with no notice properly of what I'm going to be asked. That doesn't feel to me like I'm not accountable. I'm accountable to Parliament, and in many senses we're accountable every day of the week as our inspectors do their work. It's very public. It's very, very public. Their work is published. They're under scrutiny from teachers, head teachers, governors, parents and so on. Now,
You've had 2 or 3 years. It's not a long time, and not when you look at the history of Ofsted and the 153 years or so of HMI before it. It's a relatively small dent. But what do you think you've managed to achieve in that time? Because I thought you were taking on, I have to say, I thought you were taking on the Augean stables. You know, and Hercules was able to bash a hole in one end, bash a hole in the other end, divert a river through it, sweep out all this stuff, and you probably wouldn't even get planning permission.
I might not be allowed to say this, but I love this job. I think this is a great job.
Steady on.
Yes, I really do, and perhaps I surprise myself in saying that. It really is a very enjoyable job. I actually believe at a national level I can have some influence on education policy. I happen to believe at the level of the individual school where inspection is carried out well, it has an impact. I hope, and it's maybe for others to say, not for me, but I hope that I've been able to maintain the independence of the Chief Inspector, the rigour of inspection, the quality of the advice we provide to ministers and so on. So it's a canny path to tread.
Do you 100% believe in inspection in the form that you're talking about, or do you think that actually there's still a fair way to move but you can't do everything overnight?
I happen to believe that the inspection system that was set up from 1992 was a positive move for the English education system, but I'm not complacent. I wouldn't have brought forward the changes that are now in front of Parliament if I didn't believe it could be improved.
But could Ofsted ever become lovable? I don't mean lovable in the sense of huggable, because they won't be doing their job properly. Can they move not to some cushy, cosy, friendly, backslapping relationship, but something where there's a positive, business-like feeling that improvement is something we all share, and these are not threatening people, these are actually helpful people who've got some insights that will help you improve your school.
I happen to believe that's the case perhaps in more examples than you would like to acknowledge. But I do think my aspiration is that Ofsted should be respected. I don't think inspectors will ever be loved.
Well, David Bell, thank you very much indeed, and I hope you do continue to make a difference. Thank you.